Thank heavens this exists. Thank heavens that like the world is as enchanted as I always hoped. My purpose is to seek truth and share it, seeking the purest, cleanest experiences of being. So there's no social voice or chatter. This is just me as a human being alive on this planet. Peak states are accessible to everybody. Almost everybody has had micro to macro. There's the macro road to Damascus epiphany, life-changing. And then there's the micro of I had 15 to 30 seconds on a walk with my dog where the light was coming through the trees. I just felt suddenly extra alive.
Ayahuasca has been used as a traditional medicine, and the Western thirst for this experience is also having fatal consequences.
Is this a subtle reminder to the larger psychedelic community that maybe there are people that are using these in a serial way that maybe is not necessary?
Used effectively, we can use psychedelics as a profound benefit in returning and recalibrating our best efforts to get beyond ourselves. And whether that's Burning Man, the top of a mountain, our phones and our socially constructed identities are following us into those places. I don't know whether this is true or right, but it's my last best hope, is an open source approach to having everybody have that experience, have that Gnostic initiation, mending where I'm broken, connecting with others to do what I must. Go where you have experienced the wound of the world and go where you have the skills to do something about it.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... You probably know Jamie Wheal as one of the executive directors of the Flow Genome Project, also for his book Stealing Fire, where he's gone deep for the last 10 years about this thing called a flow state that we all can tap into. And that's really exciting stuff. But he's back to talk about something different, really a bigger picture. And he says we all need to wake up and grow up and show up. What does that mean? Well, first of all, we need to wake up. We need to use peak experiences to show us the power we have inside of us and the things that we need to do in this world. Next, we need to grow up, investigate a lot of our childhood traumas and find out what's going on so we can repair those and be the best version of ourselves. And then to show up, find out what you can do to do better for the collective, for the society, and for the world. And it was great sitting down with Jamie because so many of these themes are in our latest movie, Reconnect, about my ayahuasca experiences last year in Costa Rica. I love what he's talking about. He's such a passionate guy, and I feel like his heart energy has really changed, where he used to have a lot of brain energy, and I know you're gonna enjoy this incredible episode with Jamie Wheal. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Jamie Wheal, the executive director of the Flow Genome Project and expert in the neuro-physiology of human performance. Over a decade, you've advised Fortune 500 companies like Google, Nike, and Red Bull, as well as the U.S. Naval War College on strategy, execution, and leadership. You're also the co-author of the Pulitzer Prize-nominated Stealing Fire, which investigated flow states, and your upcoming book, Recapture the Rapture, Rethinking God, Sex, and Death for a World That's Lost Its Mind, explores the limitations and potentials of biohacking, self-help, and psychedelic revolutions. Jamie, welcome to London Real.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Great to have you here. First of all, what's it like when you land in a city like London? Have you had a relationship with this place for a long time, or what does it kind of mean to you?
Well, I mean, I was born and raised here, so I grew up in the New Forest near Salisbury, and so coming back home is a mixed experience because on the one hand, I have all of these deeply nostalgic memories of England back in the day, back in the 70s, and very much kind of BBC, all creatures great and small, cricket on the village lawn, the church bells kind of thing. And then coming back to contemporary London and England, it's obviously so different, and it's not my home anymore. So I think that the senses is just nostalgia.
Right.
A feeling for all of the history and the traditions, and you see in the buildings the etched in stone and the names and the generations before. And on the other hand, this hyper modern cosmopolitan world that's completely new and foreign to me. So it's sort of delightfully ambiguous.
What do you remember about the culture and the vibe and the feelings in like 70s and 80s? Like, what was Britain then?
I think the closest I can describe that would be a reference point for people is the sense that that entire generation of kids that came of age reading Harry Potter, and the watching of the first films and the coming to Hogwarts, that sense of coming to Hogwarts, that's what I kind of grew up with. I grew up with that sense of, lineage and tradition and something ancient. So, growing up in the New Forest, we would drive past Anne Boleyn's old manor house, and there was the tree in the forest where Prince Rufus, back in the Middle Ages, was shot by his own huntsman, in a sort of assassination attempt that was, written off as an accident. And, my brother went to the cathedral school in Salisbury and used to run on his cross-country team around Old Sarum Hill and Stonehenge. So that sense of just ancientness, I think, has always been in my bones. And then coming to America, which obviously feels so new, and so everything's just immediate. I think it was that sense of both history and just the kind of the bones of a place and the lineage of the people that really has led to a lot of my curiosity and learning, which was always sort of neuroanthropology. Very much like Yuval Harari and Sapiens and Homo Deus, or what's his bucket, Jared Diamond in Guns, Germs, and Steel. Like that sense of who are we? And where have we come from?
So having that history growing up in Britain, you might not have got that growing up in Phoenix. Maybe not.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I grew up in San Diego, so there really wasn't much history. I mean, the oldest building's 50, 60 years old, and maybe there's some monks that came up from the South, but there wasn't much. So when I walk around England, I'm so steeped in it. It just feels like part of me now. You grew up in an interesting family here as well. High performance mother and father. Can you briefly talk about that and how that might have shaped your future?
Sure. I mean, very much mixed traditions. So my mother was South African. My father's family moved from London after World War II to South Africa. That's where they met. And then he came back and he submitted his applications to Cambridge and to the Royal Naval Test School. And the entry, I think, to Cambridge was something like, 7%, 8%. But the odds to get into the Royal Naval pilot training was, I think, 2%. And he got into both. And so he was like, okay, I'm going to go and do the pilot thing because I want to fly the best planes in the world. So he was, when the Concorde was still a military top secret project, he was testing that. When the Sea Harrier, the vertical takeoff jet, he was the chief test pilot on the carrier takeoffs and landings, which he described to me once was, it was like trying to land in pitch black night in the North Sea, trying to land a Harrier on an aircraft carrier. And these are the small ones. These aren't the crazy big, U.S. nuclear ones these days. Was like trying to sort of land on a pool table, by a lighter. So that was my background. It was very much the sort of the Great Santini to Top Gun, was that world.
Right.
And I was kind of getting shunted along to go to Annapolis and go to the U.S. Naval Academy. And at the last minute, kind of just didn't, and thought, okay, if I'm not gonna be a test pilot or a SEAL, because those are really the only two gigs that would have sort of passed muster. Otherwise,
with him.
I would have felt like I was just punting if I hadn't at least done that.
And he was looking toward America always?
Yeah, well, we emigrated there because my mother's love of South Africa and the landscape of Cape Town and that kind of stuff, they fell in love with the continent of North America and just the outdoors and the sense of adventure. So we grew up water skiing and snow skiing and these varying things, and they stayed. And so they fell in love with the U.S. And so, absent going the military track, my commitment was, okay, if I'm not going to do that, how do I ring that bell anyway? And so that was where my interest in surf rescue and wilderness medicine and mountain guiding and those kind of things came in. I was like, well, if no one's going to shoot at you or something like that, at least can you put yourself in mortal consequences with precision and with teamwork and with that same caliber of leadership? And can I learn there? Plus, it always just made more sense. I mean, I think maybe being a stranger in a strange land and never actually feeling a part of any culture. I was just, even as a kid, I was sort of a perpetual anthropologist. Like, what are the strange customs of these humans I'm around? You know, so nature made sense.
Right.
And I think that's always been a refuge for me.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And in your TED Talk, when you were in Venice, you said that you always felt like that outsider until you had kind of that one windsurfing incident where you probably had your first flow state experience. And I'm sure it was preposterous for your friends to hear that story, or even tell yourself that story at first, that getting on a board with a sail on it could change your life. But it did, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, people often ask sort of like, oh, okay, so what makes you tick? You know, what's your sort of quote unquote lineage? Or where did you come from, or how did you get to here? And the simplest description for me is, you know, music, mountains, mushrooms, and marriage was really it. You know, and the unlocking moves were the mountains, mushrooms, and music, right? The marriage happened to be finding a life partner in college, and then continuing this journey together in relationship, and then also with children, with family, which became the grounding element. I think otherwise I would have, you know, shot up to the mountain and never come home. Right. So that was always the filter. But the first two was really beautiful, natural immersion, where I could go and take all the angst and all the frustration of being an angry young man, you know, railing against the world that didn't seem like it made sense or lived up to my hopes or ideals, thrashing the ever-living hell out of myself, getting to a place of physical exhaustion, you know, getting my yah-yahs out, experiencing beautiful sensations of gravity, you know, whether that was zipping along, windsurfing or skiing or mountain biking, something, and then often having the moment of kind of release, like that windsurfing experience of, you know, riding along on the golden pathway of the setting sun, and just being like, oh, hell yeah, this is pretty good. You know, there's no clutter, there's no super ego, you know, so there's no social voice or chatter. This is just me as a human being alive on this planet, you know, and dynamically engaged.
Wow.
And so that became a lifeline. And then the combination of that and, you know, gathering wild mushrooms in the back cow field behind our college and trying those for the first time. And I remember sticking my hand into the koi pond on the college campus, and it was like Terminator 2, you know, like where they see he goes through the quicksilver, and I felt like I was sticking it into a completely different world. And I was like, oh my God, thank heavens this exists. Thank heavens that like the world is as enchanted as I always hoped. Because the delta between the Hogwarts early experience, you know, roaming through the forest and feeling like, you know, there was literally the land of fairy and Tolkien and everything, and then growing up and getting into the social world and it feeling like it was completely desacralized, that there was nothing worth caring about, being given back that gift and saying, you know, magic is afoot. You know, and if you just pay attention, and if you just know where the doors are, that saved my life. Honestly, it gave me something to care about and something to step up to and live into.
Okay. And that initial part of that journey was stealing fire, writing that book, and then I think you said for the next 18 years, like traveling the world and talking and teaching and working with companies and all sorts of groups around that. I mean, now in retrospect, looking back, how would you describe the major points of that experience?
Well, I mean, I think we were, you know, always just seeking the purest, cleanest experiences of being we could, and that led us everywhere from, you know, guiding on mountaineering trips in Nepal and Tibet, and taking the youngest group of American students ever up to Camp 3 on the north face of Everest, and then spending 2 days in these medieval caves at base camp, you know, having them do a meditation and fasting solo, you know, looking at Chomolungma, looking at the amazing mountain, or, you know, climbing up to tantric monasteries that were at 17,000 feet and soaking in hot springs that actually had I'm just like Indiana Jones. We were soaking in these hot springs going, isn't this the life? You know, like we busted ours to get here. This is fantastic. Here's this, you know, like the Patala Palace kind of beautiful monastery. And then suddenly one of our students screams bloody murder, and she looks down and there's a snake coiled around her ankle. And then we look at all the rocks, and suddenly the entire rocks are just moving and heaving, and there were all these snakes like sticking their heads out and sweeping around. So at 17,000 feet, it was a thermal heat sink in the Himalayas that had supported this colony of snakes. We're like, dear God. So experiences like that, where you're out there on the sharp end of life, you don't know what's going to come or what's going to happen, and it affirms your aliveness, and it gives you a sense of why we're here. That was the thread. The thread was always, how do we, you know, seek it ourselves and then share it as instructors or educators or trainers, whatever the role would be, so that, you know, in service of helping us all grow up. And my sense was, I actually we were with some CEOs. We were doing an alpine, like a skiing leadership training. And I had them do the exercise of, you know, what's your purpose? Which is a little bit cornball, but nonetheless we were doing it. Mm-hmm. And I was, as they were sitting writing, I realized I was like, son of a bitch, I've never done that. Like I've assigned this exercise. I've never actually asked myself, what's mine? And in an instant, you know, it came down to, my purpose is to seek truth and share it. And I realized that it was that dialectic. Like if I just sought truth and didn't connect to others, I would be the sort of mad hermit in a cave.
Yeah.
And if I just shared it, then I would end up being a sort of depleted cardboard cutout of my former self, which I felt like in my management consulting years. I was like, ooh, this is getting perilously close to me just pimping out my old adventuresome life for office stiffs.
Right. Yeah.
You know?
Giving the spiel.
Yeah. And so I felt like, it's that dynamic between the two. It's going to the mountaintop, coming back down, saying, hey, here's some cheat codes. Here's some root beta, like here's where we got to, here's where was hard, here's where you can rest, here's how to get to the view, and coming back down. And it's that dialogue that really, I think, has kind of driven my life.
Okay. And I mean, a lot of Stealing Fire was talking about these flow states and talking about the different levels and the different components of it and getting people to learn how to be in more flow. But at the same time, like by going down that route, you started coming up with these new ideas you have now, which is, okay, now we have these states, but then what do we do with them? And I'm just wondering, what were some of the new observations you had about Stealing Fire and some of the challenges you had? And then how did that kind of roll up into some of these new ideas? Because I think they're really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I just look backwards at kind of the earlier phases of my life that I just described briefly to you, which was, well, what makes me tick? You know, and I realized I was basically a pretty lazy and unmotivated bastard, except for those experiences that made me come alive. So, you know, I would never want to get up early in the morning, but if it was a powder day or it was good wind and waves, pow, happening. I could never in my life go to the gym and work out on a Stairmaster or a treadmill. It would seem like, you know, stick a fork in my eyeballs. But if it was a matter of climbing a mountain to get to a summit at sunrise and get to ski a beautiful line, you know, on the way down, fantastic. And so I was like, well, what's that? How do I have seemingly unlimited motivation in this category and absolutely none based on compliance or oughts and shoulds? And I thought, well, I wonder, I'm probably not alone on that. And what is that? And so that was what kind of led to the study of flow states and peak states. And what I had found is, you know, particularly with that combination of, you know, wilderness and those experiences, the sort of natural sublime, you know, which doesn't need any more justification. That's Walt Whitman and Emerson and Thoreau and, you know, the whole class of folks that, you know, got their juice from that place. Plus the psychedelic experiences, you're like, okay, there seems like there's a dynamic. There seems like there's some relationship between peak states and growing into the best people we can become. And it was sort of that notion of what Houston Smith, the scholar of religion, once said. He said, how, you know, the project is how do we take our altered states and turn them into altered traits? How do we use the peak experiences to actually raise the plateau of our overall being? And I realized accidentally, backdoor, lazy bastard, that's how I was trying to live my life. And I was forever, popping up to the high ground, looking around going, way down in the woods where we're actually on our journey, it makes sense. I see our destination from here. I understand where we're going. So when we come back down and we shoulder our burdens again, I'm not wandering lost in the woods. I'm not dragging ass and when are we there yet? Are we there? I know where we're going.
Right.
And there's a sense of ability to close that gap. So that's really, I think, the mechanics of how peak states can be so profoundly helpful. And where we are today is,
were your students understanding that? When you're teaching that to Navy SEALs and CEOs and all those people, were they getting that same realization, or does it take? Do you have to be immersed in flow for a while to start to understand that it can give you kind of the plan for the future or a bigger picture?
No, I think that's actually a sort of that's an intrinsic feature of peak states. And there's an old Greek term, but Philip K. Dick, the science fiction writer who did Blade Runner and Total Recall, he is a hat tip to him, was because he familiarized the term, which is anamnesis. And anamnesis is the opposite of amnesia. Okay. So it's literally the forgetting of the forgetting. Right?
Okay, wow, that's deep. I can think about that for a while. Okay.
So when you forget that you've forgotten, you've remembered. And what we typically remember in those states is who we are and what we're here to do.
Yeah, that describes quite a few of my psychedelic experiences.
Right? There's always that profound sense of deja vu and a deep remembering. And I always think of that, the Disney film of Sleeping Beauty, where the entire kingdom has fallen asleep under the spell. And then when they wake up, they're sort of in the middle of their conversation. There's the cook in the kitchen and he's chasing somebody. The whole thing comes back to life. And I feel like peak states so routinely do that it's a known issue. And it's that remembering of, I have a deeper knowing. Beyond the day-to-day, beyond the chatter, I have a nobler self. And I have a purpose. I have a mission. That to me is indescribably valuable. And at the same time, it feels like no sooner do we have that, we sort of power up into our fullest, high fidelity self, that there's almost always, in sort of a body scan, you'll start, and here's the laundry list of the things that are out of whack, out of integrity, not in keeping with that experience. So it's like that Suzuki Roshi joke where he's like, you're perfect exactly as you are, and you could use a little work. And my sense is that peak states do that. And that's, if that was all it was, that would still be profoundly useful. But there's also a sense, and this dovetails into PTSD and trauma work as well, which is, for instance, like when the MAPS research with MDMA and trauma therapy, what does that do? Right? If you're just a raver and you pop some Molly, you go off and you oods, you dance, you don't necessarily think about it or integrate it. But when it's in a therapeutic setting, you have that experience of, I feel fantastic, I feel like $1 million, I have, heightened oxytocin and serotonin and prolactin, I feel warm and womb-like, and I can take some of that energy and I can use it to revisit the places I'm contracted, the places I'm impacted. And because I now have safety, I'm not contracted and defended and blocking it. I can actually go into and shift that stuff. Right. So it feels to me that there's a, to your point about what's evolving after writing Stealing Fire, which was arguably a love story to the backstory of ecstasis.
Yeah.
Right? This is where we've come from, all the way back to the ancient Greeks.
Yeah.
In the 60s and the 70s to now. This next book, Recapture the Rapture, is sort of what's the relationship between those peak states and our healing and our connections and commitment to each other. So instead of just ecstasis, it's a three-legged stool, it's a triangle. And it's ecstasis, go up and remember what you've forgotten. Take some of that energy, come back to catharsis, digest our grief, integrate our trauma, stand up on our own 2 feet. And then communitas, connect with our brothers and sisters. Do what we're here to do. Like, remember that, mend this, go do what we must.
Yeah.
And that's really the sort of feels to me like the flywheel of coming into ourselves, of self-initiating, individually and collectively, into, what you could say, non-technically would just be homegrown humans. You know, head, heart, heaven and earth, masculine, feminine, you name it, all balanced and blended to do the thing. The more, and, you know, to stay in the Greek nomenclature would be anthropos, you know, which is in the Hermetic tradition, that sense of fully integrated human. Right. Leonardo's Vitruvian Man, that idea of absolutely balanced. It's not, we don't get to cut corners anymore. You know, it was enough for Pablo Picasso to be a brilliant artist, but he was a misogynistic, womanizing bastard. You know, we can't do those kind of lopsided things anymore, right? It's on us these days, because we have access to all the tools, to say nothing less than balance will be adequate for the challenges ahead.
And it's extremely relevant now. And you were talking about how you had some of these ideas, you know, 12 months, 24 months ago, and now, like, it seems more relevant than ever. And I have so many people in that leather chair, and they talk about a lot of what you just talked about, whether it's Michael Pollan talking about the rise in tribalism and his own experiences with, you know, one of those M's, you know, the mushrooms, you know, to all of those different aspects you're talking about childhood trauma with Dr. Gabor Mate and these types of things. So it's very interesting that you're coming to this now. Before we go into that, I'm curious, and I asked Stephen Kotler this as well, do you think everyone has experienced a peak state or a flow state? Because I'm sure maybe there's people watching or listening that are like, Jamie, I don't know what you're talking about. And I'm wondering, do you think everyone has? And if they have, do you think they can reflect back to that and say, yeah, I know what you mean, Jamie. When I was there, I did know where I was going, or I remembered things, and then I lost it, and now I'm back. And those are my questions for you.
Yeah, so I think, you know, the sort of standard answer is that peak states, you know, and flow states is a subcategory of that broader category, of that broader sort of domain, are accessible to everybody. And most people have, almost everybody has had some micro, there's a range, micro to macro. You know, there's the macro road to Damascus epiphany, life-changing. Right. And then there's the micro of, I had 15 to 30 seconds on a walk with my dog where the light was coming through the trees just so, and, you know, and I smelt things, and I just felt suddenly extra alive and suddenly no place else. And the thing that's often confusing for folks about the micro ones is that they're rarely the photo album flashbulb memories. They're very rarely your wedding or your prom or your graduation or the pomp and circumstance times. They're blips, and they happen in the flow of things, of life, and we typically don't tag them and label them. But when we do, we'll do an exercise with people of saying, hey, you know, do a life walk, like literally sort of take a step at a time and describe, I'm in childhood, and describe just spontaneously your peak experience there, and then take another step and say, this was my adolescence. I'm 14 years old, and we're on the soccer pitch, or I'm giving a speech or playing music, and that here I am as an adult. And the results of just that exercise, just guiding people slightly to remember and let themselves be surprised by what comes up. So no scripting and no rehearsing. People often end up weeping. They often end up sharing things with complete strangers in that exercise they haven't shared with spouses or significant others. And it's because what happens when we're in those peak states is that there's a cascade of neurochemistry. So you get norepinephrine and dopamine and anandamide and all these things that actually are memory encoders. So they say, hey, this is salient, right? This matters in some way. Save it for later, take it from short-term experience and transfer it over to long-term memory. So the memories are incredibly rich and they're profound, but we don't file them. They're lost in the stack. Right. And when we're given that experience, it's often really empowering for folks, because they're like, oh, this isn't something out there for people not like me. This is something I have lived and I've yearned for. And, you know, Csikszentmihalyi, the godfather of flow research, said, you know, these moments, you could almost say that these moments are effectively the driver of all civilization. All art, all music, all beauty, you know, and much else has been us seeking these moments that make us come alive. So in that respect, I would say absolutely, it is a birthright and it is accessible and does not need to be something mysterious. And at this point, to your sense of where are we these days, we've never had access to more ecstatic state-shifting technologies than at any point in human history. We kind of have the keys to the kingdom. And so in that respect, I would say, don't die wondering. You know, if you're curious, right, there are a dozen ways to shoot the moon. There are a dozen ways to go and see for yourself.
Such as?
Well, I mean, you can take it from the low end, where you could say, go and do a 10-day Vipassana retreat.
Right. Okay.
And that takes a bit of time, right? And it's very safe. And you would say, okay, you can go and if you're willing to invest that chunk of time and be comfortable being uncomfortable, you will have some meaningfully different relationship to yourself, your body, and your awareness than you did going in. Near as damn it. I mean, a pretty good odds.
Yeah.
Right? If you wanted to up that, you could say, hey, do something where there's physical exhaustion. You did an Ironman, right? An ultra run. I mean, we lived in the mountains of Colorado, and there's the Leadville 100, right? And that experience is a rite of passage. By 3 a.m. after you've been running for 18 hours, people are out there. And they're emotionally raw and vulnerable. They're ecstatic. I mean, it's everything.
They're hallucinating.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Yeah, right.
And you can do it that way, or you could sign up and register for one of the psychedelic therapy clinics and training, whether that's ketamine therapy or MDMA therapy. You could do something like go into a sensory deprivation float tank.
Yeah.
So there's lots of ways to shift our states.
Go to Burning Man.
You could indeed.
Okay.
I mean,
go to Disneyland. Is there a point where it doesn't necessarily get you there?
I mean, Disneyland on acid.
Okay, gotcha.
That works.
All right, so something to get you to a peak state.
Something to get you to drop, basically, the socially conditioned elements. Something to get you to shut off your default mode network, which is kind of your inner mind chatter. Something to bring you into as vitalized and aligned a body as you can help support. Right? And something to give you access to information, right? That peak experience of heightened information, awareness and processing. Those things are, generally speak for themselves after that.
Right, and now we have access to all of that. With the internet and with all these services, we can go do those things fairly readily.
Yeah.
Do you think everyone needs to do something like that?
Well, I mean, here we are sort of in the nominal psychedelic renaissance. Like after Stealing Fire, after Michael Pollan's book, there's been this massive, I mean, those books didn't create it. They were simply naming a thing that was already happening.
Yeah.
And maybe extending the awareness of it and helped crystallize it. But I think that we are in a goofy spot, because at the same time that we have more access to more psychotechnologies than any humans ever, they've also been completely ripped out of cultural context. So in all of human history, these things were closely guarded, tightly held secrets, usually passed down through a lineage with very high standards of vetting of who had access to what, when, and why. And now it's gloves off, and you can pretty much one click on Amazon and blow yourself to the moon. And so my sense is that we absolutely need to start articulating cultural parameters for what is appropriate and best use. And it is goofy, because particularly psychedelics, but any of these peak state experiences, you could say, deliberate and conscious sexuality is another one. And to your point about, has everybody had these experiences? Jenny Wade is a researcher on sexuality and found that over 15 million Americans have had accidental, spontaneous, transcendent experiences during sexuality. So that's not doing some specific protocol, that's not learning Tantra or anything like that, just making love with a partner and having some wild, non-ordinary experience. And less than half have actually shared it with their partners. Right. So you're like, because they don't know what to say or do.
Right.
So you're like, both intriguing, inspiring, and tragic, depending on which side you're looking at. Yeah. And so with these elements, and there's the whole, we got the psychedelic renaissance on one side, you've got kind of open sexuality, polyamory, open relating, sex at dawn, that whole kind of movement.
Yeah.
And there are no governors on what we're doing. So to bring it back into cultural guidelines as to how might we or ought we do this, my sense is that, just from an anthropological point of view, you could make a case that, there's a bell curve distribution. And you could say probably, hey, I mean, these are rough numbers, but roughly 10% of people should never touch psychedelics, or even any sort of overheating, deliberately ecstatic technologies. Breathwork, sexuality, sensory deprivation, those things. They have a genetic or hereditary history of mental conditions. They have a deliberate and destabilized series of traumas that are maybe not amenable to healing. They might have cluster B personality, so sociopathy, psychopathy, narcissism, those kind of things. That will make those folks worse. So 10%, take it off the table. Only 10% on the far side should ever do them more than a handful of times in their life. And the middle of the bell curve, the 80%, could arguably, what if, for instance, we had a rite of passage in adolescence? Everybody says rites of passage are essential. We have these extended adolescents. They're stretching into the mid-20s. Some people still haven't grown up by the time they're 30. There are still dudes with their Xboxes, smoking weed and jerking off to porn and playing first-person shooters.
At home,
right? At 30. And there's an entire generation of young women that are like, what the hell? I've got a man-child as a boyfriend. When will they ever grow the hell up? So definitive rites of passage feels like a really important thing. And you could say, how about, let's say, 3 grams of psilocybin? It's like that old book, Alex Haley's book, like Roots. Where in the beginning, in West Africa, his father, he's born and his father holds him up and to the night sky and he says, "Behold, Kunta Kinte, the only thing in the universe greater than you." Like, we need that experience. So that could be a rite of passage. Mm-hmm. And then marriage. What if, whether it's your wedding night or some precursor to it, you had structured and supported MDMA couples intimacy. Here's my deepest love. Here's my deepest vulnerability. Here's my heart truth. Can I say it and testify with you? And can we forge that bond at that structurally foundational level of our relating? And then potentially end-of-life preparation. And Johns Hopkins has done tons of studies with cancer patients and survivors, but what about a structured 5-MeO DMT experience, which many people who experience it report as a death rebirth experience of basically the light of source consciousness. Neat. It's a test drive, right?
Have you tried that?
I haven't not tried it.
Okay, gotcha.
So that sense of, preparation for the arguably most important transition this side of birth, you imagine just those 3 experiences. And the thing there is to say, these days, because it's so easy and because it's so accessible and because there's no cultural wrapper or guidelines, people just keep going back to the wishing well. So they'll have a life-changing experience. I remember going to a live show and one of our buddies was like, "Oh yeah, I saw Jesus. Second set, man, totally." And I'm like, well, if you saw fucking Jesus, like, why aren't you like going home, starting a ministry, doing something, God knows what. But instead, he was just going to hang out, go to the show the next night, do it all over again. And so that sense of like, if you only have 3, right, you're going to suck the marrow out of the significance, the implications, and the applications. So like Lakota warriors, right, they would do their vision quest. They'd go to the mountain, they'd put a circle of stones, they'd stay there for 4 days, they would wait for a dream vision from Great Spirit, and then that would become the lodestone for their life. They didn't come back the next weekend and the weekend after that and the year after that. They said, This was my one, amen. I stick that in my virtual medicine pouch, right? And I cherish it. And I spend the rest of my life waiting for the good day to die.
Is this a subtle reminder to the larger psychedelic community that maybe there are people that are using these in a serial way that maybe is not necessary?
Yeah,
we've all met someone who's had 65 ayahuasca experiences.
And they wear it like a badge of honor.
I know.
And I always find it profoundly suspect.
Me too.
There's the old Alan Watts, when you get the message, hang up the phone kind of thing. And I'm not that binary about it. I think there's profound benefit in returning and recalibrating over time. There's a sense of sort of, used, I think, effectively. And so we won't say appropriately, because that's a that's a fool's errand to try and assert. But used effectively, peak experiences, and we can use psychedelics as a visible, present test case, but it is in no way limited to those. Any comparably potent psychotechnologies can be used as, in a sort of 3-part way, sort of as metronome, tuning fork, and training wheels. So the metronome is back to that anamnesis, right? Am I on the one? Am I on the pulse of life? And I always think of the Carter family, the June Carter who married Johnny Cash, right? And her whole family, right? They lived in a Tennessee, Kentucky farmhouse or something like that, and with a wraparound porch. And before they would play at the Grand Ole Opry, 3 kids playing banjo and fiddle and something else would go marching off one way around the porch, and then the other half of the band would go marching off the other way. And if they met at the back of the house and they were still on the beat together, they knew they had it licked and would do a great job that night at the Opry. And I think coming back to ourselves and being like, I think I'm on the one, but I'm not sure. Can I come back to source? Can I come back to self? And can I just, I was a half bit ahead, I was galloping, I was lagging, I'm back on. So the metronome feels important. And then the lag time between my last peak state, where I've powered up into my truest best self, and now I've probably been pulled down by the density and the gravity and the 1,000 tiny cuts of life. The haters have taken their shots, right? And so my instrument is probably a little out of key. And so the tuning fork is like, hey, here's perfect middle C. Where are you? Are you sharp? Are you flat? Can you just tune such that your instrument is back again? And then the training wheels. I now feel, and then back to the PTSD therapy that MAPS is doing with MDMA, I feel safe, I feel whole, I feel loved, I feel enough. I'm not contracting, I'm not coming from scarcity, right? And I'm able to live open-heartedly and even courageously and creatively. Right. Can I practice that? And can I actually feel like what it's like to come from a supersaturated state? And can I actually get that into my muscle memory?
Okay, so you can take the wheels off.
So then later. I can take the wheels off. And I think that's actually one of the profound benefits of an event like Burning Man compared to a weekend festival or compared to kind of a one and done experience, is that people go to Burning Man, the environment, the conditions, the sensory overwhelm, the substance and sexuality, you name it, it's every ecstatic technology in the world bung together. But what happens is people crack open, so they'll have a breakthrough experience, and then they've got 3, 4, 5 days interacting with other people in a shared archetypal improv of let's extend this jam. Let's practice what it means to not just be somewhere deep in the desert, communing with the stars, but actually sharing drinks and playing games and building things and dancing together. And so it really becomes more somatically registered and more sort of somatically landed. So that would be my sense, is that if we sort of create hedonic engineering would be what's the actual rational, practical art of tuning our states in service of our long-term development, growth, and outcomes, right? What do we actually do with it? And if you do that, you can kind of create a flywheel where we're doing the good things for us every day. That's the flossing your teeth and the 15 minutes sitting and the physical exercise and anything that is just raising our foundational practice. Hard to overdo, most of them, unless you're super type A and compulsive. Mm-hmm. And then a sort of once a week Sabbath experience, like reclaim half a day out of 7 that lets you reset deeply. Once a month, give yourself a full day, clear the decks, and actually go big. Once a season, a weekend, once a year, a week. And if you have, because what we've got right now is access to the atom bombs, right? I'm going to go down to Peru and do an ayahuasca retreat. I'm going to go to Burning Man. I'm going to do the thing. And it's blow ourselves apart in a million pieces. But then we're all trying to reassemble our spaceships in our driveways. No one has the instruction manual, and there's a lot of left missing bolts and pieces, and we go from a, light speed back to, holy shit, this is Monday morning, and I'm wearing this monkey suit, and I've got this shitty job, and I'm sitting in the traffic, and what the hell? And we don't have any of the middle of coming back to the metronome, the tuning fork, and the training wheels. And I feel like the micro and the meso sacrament is the piece that we're missing culturally right now. The macro, the atom bomb, we've got access to it. But it's the interstitial stuff that's really key to helping us integrate and actually make the most of these things.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I was super excited to talk to you about today, because as you know, we're about to premiere our 5th documentary feature film, and it started after my Ironman race last year. It was like a month after, and Dennis McKenna was like, Brian, come down to Costa Rica. We're going to do these ayahuasca ceremonies. Bring your film crew and let's go. Cool. And I was resisting because I was just like, I don't know, are we going to make a movie? I don't want to make I don't want to make another ayahuasca movie. We've all seen too many ayahuasca movies. And I was like, I don't want to do that. Now, we've been talking about psychedelics and plant medicines for 7 years. And so, you know, we know these things, but I didn't want to go down there just to do it. But we did it anyways. And I ended up having the second ceremony was the most profound experience of my life, something that taught me so much and also reminded me that for me, ayahuasca is the mother of all psychedelics. It's the one that gives me lessons. It gives me 10 commandments. You know, because this is exactly what you need to do. Talk about training wheels and tuning forks. I mean, it was really, this is what you need to do. And towards the end of the ceremony, she said, let's review what you will not forget tomorrow.
Oh, no way.
Let's go back to these 10 things. And that's something I always get. I don't get with psilocybin. I definitely don't get with DMT. So it was profound. And of course, I get dropped back in London way too soon, like literally a day after that last ceremony, and dropped into the madness of what we do here. And now it's time for me to integrate. And I'm telling my wife all of our future and her new role in this whole new reality, of course, that I've seen crystal clear. I'm telling my team that as well. And of course, it doesn't work like that, the way you just described it, because we have these atom bombs and now I'm back to the laundry, right, after the ecstasy. So we kind of show this whole process, and also I'm trying to figure out how the community plays in on this. And this is where, you know, your upcoming book plays in. Like, how do we interact with each other? How do we deal with things that feel like they've been weaponized, like climate change, where what is going on? I don't know. Something's going on. It doesn't feel right. But I don't know. People are getting angry and they're divided over it. And so I'm doing all of this. And then, of course, my childhood traumas come up as well. So you're 7 years old, your parents are divorced, and this always comes up with me in these ceremonies, and it's limiting me. So I end up flying back to San Diego and getting both my parents on camera and asking them about the divorce. So It's funny how you show up today with many of the themes that I'm struggling with, and this whole concept of quote unquote integration, which is a word that's been used a lot lately, I guess, in the psychedelic communities, which is, I guess, trying to make sense of this atom bomb and then try to find a way to bring those learnings into a new version of your life. So I don't know, based on that, everything I just dumped on you, I'm just curious of some of the things you see there. Also, I'm not expecting the greatest reception from the quote unquote psychedelic community, because sometimes it's the panacea, it's the have this experience and everything's gonna be okay. Although I'm probably generalizing, but we're trying to say it's not about that. It's another one of these peak states, and if you don't treat it the right way, it's gonna come with, you know, struggles, and if you don't do the work, it's not necessarily gonna be something you can benefit from. So that's what we've kind of learned, and we're trying to put that in 90 minutes, you know. So it's been a lot of fun, obviously, trying to do that. I don't know, what do you think of all that, Jamie?
Yeah, I mean, you know, you're not alone. This is the sort of pernicious nut to crack for all of us, and I mean, I think about this a lot, because how do we reconcile what you just described? You went down to Costa Rica and had the most profound experience of your life. You know, amen, God bless. You know, nothing but gratitude for that kind of a thing, that I get to have lived a life that includes that in it.
That's how I felt.
Yeah. And at the same time, some bitch, man, where's the transmission? How do I take like starlight and learn to grow corn? And that transition is arguably the entire human project. And I think there's a lot of, because we've yanked it out of culture, right? We're just having these experiences and jacking into power feeds. I always think of, like, there's that Far Side cartoon, two mosquitoes, you know, and one of them is in an arm and he's blown up like a balloon. It's like, pull out, Hal, pull out, you hit an artery, right? And that's kind of what we're doing with psychedelic and ecstatic technologies. We are jacking in to the main vein and just literally like blowing our minds.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.